Samuel Carter's hands trembled, holding his resume when rejection came. Mr. Whitfield's voice was cold, final. No second chances for men like him. Days later, fate twisted. Emma Whitfield, 10 years old, vanished into the hands of monsters Samuel once knew. He followed shadows through Atlanta's forgotten places, using prison knowledge to track the kidnappers. When he found her, bound and terrified, he became what the world refused to see, a protector. Subscribe to witness how one man's past became the key to saving an innocent life and rewriting his future. Samuel Carter stood in the waiting room on the 14th floor of Whitfield Enterprises, his worn shoes making no sound against the polished marble that reflected a man he barely recognized anymore. The resume in his hands felt like a confession, each line a carefully constructed bridge between who he had been in those grey years behind bars and who he desperately wanted to become in the unforgiving light of freedom. His fingers had smoothed the paper so many times that morning that the edges had begun to soften, as if the document itself was tired of being handled with such fragile hope. Around him, the office hummed with the quiet efficiency of success. Phones ringing in distant cubicles, the whisper of expensive fabric as executives passed through hallways, the subtle scent of imported coffee mixing with the sterile coolness of air conditioning. He had practiced his words 100 times in the mirror of his small apartment, imagining how he would explain the gap in his employment history, how he would look Mr. Whitfield in the eye and promise that the man who had made those mistakes no longer existed. But now, surrounded by glass walls and people in tailored suits who had never known the taste of prison food or the sound of metal doors locking behind them each night, Samuel felt the old shame creeping up his spine like cold water rising in a sinking ship. The receptionist called his name with a voice that suggested she had already forgotten it before the syllables left her lips, and Samuel rose with the careful deliberacy of a man who had learned to move without drawing attention to himself. He followed her down a corridor where his reflection appeared and disappeared in a series of glass panels, each image showing him a slightly different version of his weathered face. 48 years old, but looking older, lines carved deep around his eyes from squinting in bright prison yards, and darker moments he tried not to remember. The office at the end of the hall belonged to Richard Whitfield, and even before Samuel crossed the threshold, he could sense the power that lived in that space, like a presence with its own heartbeat. The desk was massive, dark wood that probably cost more than Samuel had earned in the last 5 years of legitimate work, and behind it sat a man whose silver hair and sharp suit spoke of a life lived without apology or doubt. Whitfield barely glanced up from the papers before him, his fingers steepled in a gesture that Samuel recognized from 1,000 authority figures who had decided his fate without really seeing him. The handshake was brief, professional, and completely empty of warmth, as if physical contact with Samuel might somehow contaminate the clean lines of Whitfield's carefully constructed world. Samuel sat in the chair across from the desk, feeling the leather beneath him, so different from the hard plastic of prison visiting rooms, and began to speak the words he had rehearsed, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. But Whitfield cut him off before Samuel could finish his first explanation, raising one manicured hand in a gesture that silenced as effectively as a slammed door, and the CEO's eyes finally met Samuel's with a directness that felt more like an autopsy than a conversation. "Mr. Carter," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who had never questioned his right to judge others, "I appreciate you taking the time to come in today, but I need to be straightforward with you about our hiring policies." Samuel felt something inside him begin to crystallize, that familiar hardening that happened whenever hope started to die, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact, to not look away like he had been trained to do in the presence of guards and wardens. Whitfield continued, pulling Samuel's resume across the desk with 2 fingers as if the paper itself might carry some contagion, his eyes scanning the dates and the carefully worded explanations that Samuel's parole officer had helped him craft. "This company has a reputation to maintain," Whitfield explained, his tone suggesting he was being reasonable, even kind in his rejection. "Our clients expect a certain standard, and while I'm sure you're working hard to rebuild your life, I simply cannot take the risk of employing someone with a criminal record." The words landed like blows, each one precise and devastating, and Samuel felt the old anger stirring beneath his carefully maintained composure, that rage he had learned to swallow and digest during all those years when survival meant making himself smaller, quieter, less threatening. He wanted to tell Whitfield about the classes he had taken behind bars, the certifications he had earned while other inmates spent their time fighting or dealing or surrendering to the slow death of institutionalization. But the set of Whitfield's jaw told Samuel that no achievement would be enough to erase the stain of his past. Samuel thought about Emma, the daughter whose photograph sat on the corner of Whitfield's desk in a silver frame that probably cost more than Samuel's monthly rent, a little girl with bright eyes and a smile that had never known fear or want, protected by walls of money and privilege that Samuel could never scale. He wondered if Whitfield had any idea what it meant to rebuild a life from nothing, to wake up every morning in a world that had moved on without you, to face rejection after rejection while trying to maintain the belief that redemption was possible. The silence in the office stretched until it became unbearable, filled with all the things Samuel wanted to say, but knew would only make him look desperate or angry, or exactly like the kind of person Whitfield believed him to be. Finally, Samuel stood, his movements slow and controlled, and extended his hand one more time, forcing Whitfield to acknowledge him as a human being, even in this moment of dismissal. The CEO shook hands again, already looking past Samuel to the next appointment, the next task, his attention withdrawing like water, draining from a sink. Samuel walked out of that office with his resume still clutched in one hand, the paper now damp from his palm's nervous sweat, and he did not allow himself to feel the full weight of the rejection until he was alone in the elevator. Descending through the gleaming tower toward the street below, his reflection in the polished steel doors showed him what Whitfield had seen. A man marked by hard years, wearing a suit from a thrift store that almost fit, carrying the invisible brand of his mistakes like a scarlet letter written in a language everyone could read. The elevator passed floor after floor, each one representing lives and opportunities that would remain forever out of Samuel's reach, and he counted his breaths the way his therapist had taught him, trying to keep the panic from becoming something larger and more consuming. When the doors finally opened onto the lobby, he stepped out into the flow of purposeful people rushing toward their important meetings and legitimate careers, and Samuel felt more invisible than he had even in prison, where at least his existence had been acknowledged, even if only as a number on a jumpsuit. He pushed through the revolving doors into the Atlanta afternoon, where the September heat hit him like a wall, and the noise of traffic provided a strange comfort, a reminder that the world was too busy to care about his failures. Standing on the sidewalk outside Whitfield Enterprises, Samuel looked up at the building's glass facade reflecting clouds and sky, making the structure seem ethereal and untouchable, a tower reaching toward heaven, while men like him remained grounded in the dirt of their pasts. He folded his resume carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, knowing he would need it again tomorrow when he went to the next job interview on his list, and the next one after that, each rejection teaching him a little more about how the world saw him. A woman in an expensive coat brushed past him without apology, her perfume a brief intrusion of beauty and wealth, and Samuel stepped aside to let the flow of humanity move around him as if he were a stone in a river that had learned not to resist the current. He had survived worse than this, he reminded himself, had endured years of being reduced to nothing, and then, slowly, painfully, rebuilt some small version of dignity and purpose. But standing there on that busy street corner, watching people live lives that seemed effortless in their normalcy, Samuel felt the old temptation to simply disappear, to stop fighting against the gravity of his past and let it pull him back down into the darkness where expectations were lower and disappointment was just another word for Tuesday. 3 days after the rejection, Samuel was working a cash-in-hand job at a construction site on the east side of Atlanta, hauling materials and cleaning up debris for a foreman who didn't ask questions as long as the work got done and done well. The sun beat down on the exposed concrete and rebar with an intensity that made the air shimmer, and Samuel welcomed the physical exhaustion that came from 10-hour days of manual labor because it left less room in his mind for the bitterness that wanted to take root. His hands, already calloused from years of prison work details, gripped heavy planks and bags of concrete, mixed with the automatic efficiency of someone who had learned to find purpose in even the most thankless tasks. During his lunch break, Samuel sat in the shade of an unfinished wall, eating the sandwich he had packed that morning and watching the traffic flow past on the street beyond the construction fence, a river of lives moving toward destinations he could only imagine. The other workers kept their distance, not out of hostility, but out of the unspoken understanding that everyone on this crew was here because other doors had closed, and privacy was a form of respect among men who had learned to guard their stories. Samuel was chewing the last bite of his lunch when he saw the black SUV slide past the site, moving slowly enough that his attention snagged on it the way a shirt catches on a nail, and something in the way the vehicle moved triggered an alertness he had developed during his years inside, where survival often depended on reading the subtle language of threat. The SUV's windows were tinted dark enough to violate most legal standards, and Samuel watched it disappear around the corner before returning his focus to the remains of his meal, telling himself that paranoia was a prison habit he needed to break. But the vehicle appeared again, 10 minutes later, making another slow pass, and this time Samuel was standing near the fence, pretending to check the alignment of some materials while his eyes tracked the SUV's progress. Through the windshield, just for a moment before the angle changed, Samuel caught a glimpse of the driver's profile, and recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. Terrence Wade, a man Samuel had known in the Georgia State Prison, someone who had been released 2 years before Samuel, and who had made it very clear that he had no intention of going straight. Wade had been dangerous inside, the kind of predator who preyed on weaker inmates, and who had connections to organized crime networks that operated both behind bars and in the free world. Samuel felt his pulse quicken as old instincts fired, the ones that had kept him alive during his incarceration, the ability to sense when violence was moving through the air, like a change in atmospheric pressure. He turned away from the fence and walked back toward the construction site's interior, forcing himself to breathe slowly and evenly, knowing that drawing attention to himself now would be worse than useless. That evening, after his shift ended and he had collected his day's pay in cash from the foreman, Samuel took a different route home than usual, walking through neighborhoods that felt safer because they were more populated, even though the faces he passed were strangers who would not remember him if anything went wrong. His small apartment was in a building that had seen better decades, the kind of place where the rent was low enough that landlords didn't perform background checks too carefully, and neighbors minded their business as a matter of survival rather than courtesy. Samuel climbed the stairs to his third-floor unit, his muscles aching from the day's work, and let himself into the single room that contained everything he owned in the world: a mattress on the floor, A small television he had bought at a pawn shop, a hot plate for cooking, and a bookshelf made of cinder blocks and plywood, where he kept the few books that had sustained him through his sentence. He stood in the shower, letting lukewarm water wash away the construction dust and sweat, and tried to convince himself that seeing Wade had been coincidence, that the SUV's slow passes meant nothing. But Samuel had learned in prison that coincidences were usually just patterns you hadn't recognized yet, and the feeling of wrongness sat in his stomach like a stone while he heated up a can of soup for dinner. He ate standing by the window that looked out over the parking lot and the street beyond, watching the evening deepen into night while the sodium streetlights flickered on one by one, casting their orange glow over a landscape of cracked asphalt and aging cars. Samuel thought about calling his parole officer, reporting what he had seen, but he knew how that conversation would go. He would sound paranoid, like he was looking for excuses to explain why he couldn't hold down legitimate work. And besides, what could he really report, except that he had seen someone he used to know driving past a construction site? The television murmured in the background, a news broadcast that Samuel wasn't really watching, until a familiar name cut through his distraction like a knife. Richard Whitfield was being interviewed about some philanthropic initiative his company was launching. Standing in front of his building's entrance with that same confident smile Samuel had seen during their brief meeting, and behind him, holding his hand, was his daughter Emma. The camera lingered on the girl for just a moment, her face bright with the unself-conscious happiness of a child who had never been given reason to fear the world. And Samuel felt an unexpected surge of protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. He turned off the television and sat in the darkness of his apartment, listening to the sounds of the building around him. Arguments through thin walls, footsteps on the stairs, the distant wail of sirens that were as much a part of the city's nighttime soundtrack as crickets might be in the country. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by dreams that blurred memory and fear into surreal narratives where Samuel was back in prison but the walls kept shifting, and Wade was there, always just out of reach, speaking in a voice that Samuel could almost hear but never quite understand. He woke before dawn, with the certainty that something was moving beneath the surface of his ordinary life, some current that would soon break through and drag him under, and the feeling was so strong that he got up and dressed, even though he had nowhere to be for hours. Samuel made coffee on his hot plate, the cheap instant kind that tasted like burnt dirt, but contained enough caffeine to clear his head, and he stood at the window again, watching the parking lot lighten as the sun rose somewhere beyond the buildings. A black SUV was parked at the far end of the lot, in a spot that gave a clear view of the building's entrance, and even from 3 floors up and through the morning haze, Samuel knew with absolute certainty that it was the same vehicle he had seen the day before. His hands tightened around the coffee mug until his knuckles went white, and he forced himself to remain still, to not do anything that might draw attention from whoever was watching, because he understood now that the surveillance had nothing to do with him personally, but with something larger and more dangerous. He called in sick to the construction site, losing a day's pay he could not afford to lose, and spent the morning watching the SUV from different windows in the building, tracking when it left and when it returned, noting the shift change when a different vehicle took its place in the afternoon. Samuel knew the patterns of surveillance from his years of being watched inside, and he recognized the professional efficiency of what he was seeing, the way the vehicles never stayed long enough to be obvious but maintained enough presence to ensure their target never left visual range. By evening, Samuel had made his decision, the kind of choice that meant stepping back into a world he had promised himself he would leave behind forever. But the alternative was to do nothing while something terrible unfolded. And he had spent too many years watching bad things happen to good people because nobody was willing to act. He left his apartment after dark, moving through the streets with the careful anonymity he had perfected, and made his way toward the wealthy neighborhood where Richard Whitfield lived with his daughter in a house that Samuel had looked up online, memorizing the address even though he told himself he would never need to know it. The Whitfield home sat behind iron gates in a neighborhood where the houses were separated by walls and distance, each property a small kingdom unto itself, with manicured lawns that looked like they had been painted rather than grown. Samuel watched from across the street, partially hidden by the shadow of an old oak tree whose branches reached toward the lampposts like fingers grasping for light. And he felt the weight of class difference pressing down on him more heavily than any physical burden he had carried at the construction site. The house itself was a study in understated wealth, brick and stone with tall windows that glowed warmly in the night, revealing glimpses of interior spaces that spoke of comfort and security so absolute that the people inside probably never thought about either. Samuel counted 3 surveillance cameras visible from his position, professional installations that suggested Whitfield took his family's safety seriously, though whether that security would be enough against the kind of threat Samuel suspected was gathering remained to be seen. He stayed in the shadows for over an hour, watching the patterns of light and movement inside the house, seeing Emma pass by an upstairs window once, her silhouette small and innocent against the soft glow of what was probably a bedroom lamp. The black SUV Samuel had been tracking appeared at 10:30, sliding past the house without slowing, but with enough deliberate attention that Samuel knew the occupants were mapping the location, noting details, building the kind of intelligence that preceded action. He recognized the methodology from stories shared in prison, the careful preparation that distinguished professional criminals from desperate amateurs, and the recognition filled him with a cold dread that was different from fear. This was the certainty of seeing disaster approach, with the slow inevitability of a storm front moving across a plain. Wade was not working alone. The coordination of the vehicles, the systematic surveillance, all pointed to a larger operation, probably the same crew he had been connected to inside, men who had refined kidnapping into a brutal business model that targeted wealthy families and extracted ransoms before the authorities could mobilize effectively. Samuel had heard Wade boast about past operations during their time inside, stories told with the casual pride of someone describing a successful business venture, and the memory of those conversations now played in Samuel's mind with new and terrible significance. He thought about going to the police, but he knew how that would unfold. They would take his statement with barely concealed skepticism, an ex-convict with vague suspicions about men he used to know, and by the time they decided to take him seriously, if they ever did, Emma Whitfield would already be gone. Samuel spent the next 2 days following the surveillance pattern, mapping the movements of Wade's crew with the same methodical attention they were applying to the Whitfield family, and in the process, he began to see the shape of their plan emerging like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. They were watching Emma's routine, noting when she left for school in the morning, which route the family's driver took, where the security was tightest, and where gaps existed in the coverage. Samuel realized with growing urgency that the kidnapping would happen soon, probably within the week, during one of the narrow windows when Emma was most vulnerable, either during the morning commute to school or in the brief period when she was dropped off at her after-school activities. He began carrying a small notebook, recording times and locations, building his own intelligence file, even as he worked his construction shifts, and maintained the appearance of a man simply trying to survive. His body ached from the long days and sleepless nights, but Samuel pushed through the exhaustion with a focus he had not felt since his early days in prison, when every moment had required hypervigilance just to make it to the next sunrise. On the 3rd night of his surveillance, Samuel saw something that confirmed his worst fears and crystallized the urgency of the situation. Wade's SUV was joined by 2 other vehicles, and the men who emerged for a brief meeting in a fast-food parking lot were faces Samuel recognized from the inside. A reunion of predators who had scattered to the wind after their releases, and who had now reconvened for this particular hunting expedition. Among them was Marcus Lee, a man who had been convicted of armed robbery and who had the cold, empty eyes of someone for whom violence was not a last resort but a preferred tool, and Dwayne Fuller, whose specialty had been breaking and entering, but who had evolved into something darker during his years behind bars. The three men talked for less than 5 minutes, their body language relaxed and confident, and when they dispersed back to their vehicles, Samuel felt the timeline accelerating, the sense that whatever was going to happen would happen very soon. He followed Wade's SUV at a careful distance, maintaining enough space that he would not be noticed but staying close enough to track its destination. And the chase led him to a warehouse district on the industrial outskirts of Atlanta, where the streets were empty after dark and the buildings stood like tombstones, marking the graves of dead businesses. Wade parked the SUV outside a warehouse whose windows had been painted black, and Samuel watched from a distance as Wade and Lee entered the building, their movements quick and purposeful. Samuel waited, counting minutes, and when the men did not emerge, he made the decision to get closer, moving through the shadows with the silent efficiency he had learned from 1,000 prison yard maneuvers, where being seen meant becoming a target. He circled the warehouse, finding a side window that had been left partially open, probably for ventilation, and through the gap he could see into a large space that had been converted into a kind of staging area. Inside were supplies that made Samuel's blood run cold: rope, duct tape, black bags of the kind used to hood victims, and a mattress on the floor that suggested they were preparing to hold someone for an extended period. Maps were spread across a table, and even from his limited vantage point, Samuel could see the Whitfield home marked with red circles and arrows, indicating routes and timing. He pulled back from the window, his heart hammering, and for a long moment he simply stood in the darkness between buildings, wrestling with the magnitude of what he had discovered and the impossible choice it presented. He could go to the police now, with concrete evidence of criminal planning, but the time it would take to convince them to act, to secure warrants, to mobilize a response, all of that meant hours or even days during which Wade's crew could accelerate their timeline or simply disappear, relocating their operation beyond reach. Or Samuel could try to warn Richard Whitfield directly, though he could already imagine how that conversation would go. An ex-convict showing up at a wealthy man's gate with a wild story about a kidnapping plot, only to be dismissed as crazy or threatening or both. The third option was the one that terrified Samuel most, because it was the one that felt most right, most necessary, even though it meant stepping fully back into a world of violence and risk that he had sworn to leave behind forever. He could stay close, continue his surveillance, and when Wade's crew made their move, Samuel could intervene. Using his knowledge of their tactics and his understanding of how men like them operated to disrupt the kidnapping and save Emma Whitfield before she could be taken. It was insane, impossible, the kind of plan that would most likely end with Samuel back in prison or worse. But as he stood there in the shadows, listening to the distant sounds of the city and feeling the weight of his past pressing against the fragile hope of his future, Samuel knew that he had already made his choice. The next morning, Samuel called the construction foreman and quit his job, offering no explanation beyond a vague reference to personal circumstances. And the foreman accepted his resignation with the indifference of someone who had seen workers come and go like tides. Samuel spent his remaining cash on supplies he thought he might need: a prepaid phone, basic first aid materials, energy bars that could be eaten quickly, a cheap pair of binoculars from a pawn shop, and a small knife that he told himself was only for cutting rope or tape, if it came to that. He set up a position across from Emma Whitfield's school, a private academy with brick walls and playing fields that looked like something from a movie about privileged childhoods, and he watched the morning drop-off routine with an attention that bordered on obsessive. Emma arrived at 8:15, emerging from a sleek sedan, with a driver who looked professional but not particularly alert, and she walked into the school building with a backpack bouncing against her shoulders and her hair catching the morning light in a way that made Samuel's chest ache with the innocence of it all. He imagined what her capture would do to that lightness, how it would shatter something essential in a child who had never known real fear, and the thought was enough to cement his resolve, even as doubt continued to whisper that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. 2 days of watching taught Samuel that Emma's most vulnerable moment came not during the morning commute, which was too public and witnessed, but during the afternoon pickup, when she participated in a piano lesson at a music school 3 blocks from the academy, a 30-minute window where she was escorted by a single teacher who clearly viewed the duty as routine rather than requiring vigilance. Samuel watched Wade's crew arrive on the second afternoon, their SUV parking in a spot that offered a clear view of the music school's entrance, and he knew with the certainty of someone reading a language they had learned through pain that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The street was quiet, residential in character with tall trees that created pockets of shadow, and the music school itself was a converted house with wide windows through which Samuel could see young students at pianos, their small fingers moving across keys, while parents waited in a parlor decorated with framed concert posters and comfortable chairs. Emma was visible through one of the windows, her face serious with concentration as she worked through some piece that Samuel could not hear from his position across the street, and he felt time beginning to stretch and thin, the way moments always did before violence broke the surface of normal life. Wade emerged from the SUV at 3:45, exactly when Emma's lesson was scheduled to end, and he was joined by Marcus Lee, both men dressed casually enough to blend into the neighborhood, but moving with a purposeful energy that Samuel recognized as the final preparation before action. They positioned themselves near the music school's front entrance, one on each side of the walkway, and Samuel saw Marcus checking his phone repeatedly, coordinating with someone Samuel could not see, but who was probably positioned in another vehicle, ready to serve as a getaway driver once the snatch was complete. Samuel's hands were shaking as he watched, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that came with knowing he was about to do something that could not be undone, and he whispered a prayer he had not spoken since childhood, asking for strength or wisdom or just the ability to not fail when it mattered most. The teacher emerged first, holding the door open for Emma, who followed with her music books clutched against her chest, and everything that happened next seemed to unfold in the strange slow motion that Samuel remembered from fights in the prison yard, where each second contained infinite detail and possibility. Wade moved first, stepping forward with practiced casualness and saying something to Emma that made her pause, her face showing confusion rather than fear, because children from safe neighborhoods had not yet learned to recognize predators. Marcus moved in from the other side, boxing her in, and Samuel was already running, his feet pounding against pavement, while his mind catalogued distances and angles and the horrifying realization that he might be too late. He saw Marcus reach for Emma, saw her mouth open in the beginning of a scream that would be muffled before it could fully form. And then Samuel was there, hitting Marcus with all the force of his momentum and 48 years of accumulated desperation. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, and Samuel felt something in his shoulder tear as they hit the concrete, but the pain was distant, unimportant compared to the need to keep Marcus away from the girl. Wade turned at the sound of the impact, his face showing surprise that quickly morphed into recognition, and then rage, and Samuel knew he had seconds at best before Wade recovered and joined the fight. He drove his elbow into Marcus's throat, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to make the man gag and recoil, and Samuel rolled away, putting himself between the two kidnappers and Emma, who had stumbled backward and was now pressed against the music school's wall with her eyes wide and her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. The teacher was screaming, fumbling for her phone, and Samuel could hear other sounds now, doors opening in nearby houses, people shouting questions, the beginning of chaos that would either save them or trap Samuel in a situation he could not escape. Wade pulled a knife, the blade short but wicked-looking, and advanced on Samuel with the careful footwork of someone who had used such weapons before, and Samuel felt the old prison instincts taking over, the way his body remembered how to move, where to position his weight, how to read the subtle shifts that preceded an attack. They circled each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and Samuel was aware of Emma behind him, her presence a weight and a purpose, the reason he could not afford to fail, even as his shoulder screamed in agony and his breath came in ragged gasps. The fight was brief and brutal, more desperate scrabbling than practice technique, and Samuel took a cut across his forearm, blocking Wade's first thrust, the hot line of pain accompanied by the slick feeling of blood soaking into his sleeve. But Samuel had learned in prison that survival was not about winning cleanly, but about being willing to endure more than your opponent, and he grabbed Wade's knife hand and twisted, hearing something crack that might have been bone or might have been his own wrist. He could not tell and did not care. The knife clattered to the ground, and Samuel drove his forehead into Wade's face with enough force that he saw stars exploding in his vision. But Wade went down, and that was all that mattered. Marcus was back on his feet now, but sirens were wailing in the distance, growing louder with each second, and the calculation happening behind Marcus's eyes was one Samuel understood perfectly. The job was blown. Staying meant capture. And so Marcus grabbed Wade by the arm and hauled him toward the SUV that was already pulling up to the curb. Samuel watched them flee, his vision swimming from pain and exhaustion. And then he turned to Emma, who was still pressed against the wall, trembling but whole, and he held up his hands in a gesture meant to be reassuring, even though he was bleeding, and probably looked more frightening than the men he had just fought off. The teacher was beside Emma now, pulling the girl close and looking at Samuel with an expression that combined gratitude and terror in equal measure, and Samuel understood that he needed to leave before the police arrived, and turned him from hero into suspect, because his record would speak louder than any explanation he could offer. But before he could move, Emma stepped forward, breaking free from the teacher's protective embrace, and she looked at Samuel with eyes that held a clarity beyond her years, and said simply, "Thank you." Those two words hit Samuel harder than any of Marcus's blows had, carrying a weight of recognition that felt like absolution, and he nodded once, unable to trust his voice, before turning and walking away as quickly as his injured body would allow. Behind him, he could hear the teacher calling out for him to wait, and the sirens were very close now, but Samuel did not stop, did not look back, just focused on putting distance between himself and the scene before his presence complicated everything and turned Emma's rescue into something that could be questioned or challenged or used against him. Samuel spent the next 3 hours in a bus station bathroom, washing the blood from his arm at a sink, while travelers passed through without giving him more than a glance, because people in places like this had learned to see only what they needed to see, and nothing more. The cut was not as deep as he had feared, more of a long slice than a true laceration, and he bandaged it with supplies from the first aid kit he had bought, wrapping the gauze tightly enough to stem the bleeding, but not so tight that it cut off circulation. His shoulder throbbed with a persistent ache that suggested he had torn something more serious than a muscle strain, but there was nothing to be done about it except endure, And Samuel had spent years learning to live with pain that could not be immediately treated. He changed his shirt in a stall, stuffing the blood-stained one into a trash bin and emerging in a clean t-shirt from his small backpack. And then he bought a cup of terrible coffee from a vending machine and sat in one of the plastic chairs, watching news reports on the television mounted above the departure boards. The story broke on the local news at 5:30, presented with the breathless urgency that came with crimes against children from prominent families. And Samuel watched his own intervention reduced to 30 seconds of description by a reporter standing outside the music school. Emma Whitfield, they said, had been targeted by kidnappers who fled when a bystander intervened, and the police were looking for both the perpetrators and the unknown man who had prevented the abduction. The reporter described Samuel as possibly Hispanic or African American, medium height, wearing dark clothing, and Samuel had to suppress a bitter laugh at how wrong those details were, how witnesses reduced people to broad strokes that served the story rather than accuracy. Richard Whitfield appeared on screen, standing outside his home with his hand protectively on Emma's shoulder, and the gratitude in his face was raw and genuine, completely different from the cold judgment Samuel had seen in the CEO's office just days before. Whitfield spoke about his daughter's trauma, about his family's terror, about the miraculous intervention that had saved Emma from an ordeal that could have lasted days or weeks, or ended in ways too terrible to contemplate. And he made an appeal for the rescuer to come forward so that proper thanks could be given. Samuel turned off his phone, severing the connection to a world that would soon be looking for him, with intentions both grateful and suspicious. And he tried to think through his next moves with a clarity that kept eluding him as exhaustion pulled at the edges of his consciousness. He could disappear, leave Atlanta entirely, and start over in some other city where his face was not about to be plastered across news broadcasts and social media. But running felt like returning to the person he had been before prison, always moving, always hiding, never allowing himself the dignity of standing still and facing consequences. Or he could come forward, as Whitfield was asking, and hope that gratitude would outweigh the inevitable scrutiny of his criminal record. The questions about why an ex-convict happened to be in the right place at the right time. The suspicion that always clung to men like him, even when they did everything right. Samuel finished his coffee, the bitter liquid leaving a metallic taste that reminded him of prison water, and he made his decision with the same inevitability that had driven him to intervene in the first place. He would go to Whitfield directly, not to the police or the media, and he would tell the truth about everything, from the rejection at the job interview to the surveillance he had conducted to the fight outside the music school. It was a gamble that could end with him back behind bars on charges of stalking or worse. But Samuel had learned that the only thing more exhausting than being hunted was hunting yourself through endless cycles of fear and evasion. He waited until nightfall before making his way back across the city, moving through streets that had become familiar during his days of surveillance. And he approached the Whitfield home with his hands visible and empty, knowing that security would be heightened after the attempted kidnapping. The gates were closed and probably locked, but Samuel pressed the intercom button and waited, counting his heartbeats while cameras tracked his position from multiple angles. A voice crackled through the speaker, professional and alert, asking him to state his business, and Samuel leaned close to the microphone and said simply, "My name is Samuel Carter. I'm the one who stopped the kidnapping this afternoon. I need to speak with Mr. Whitfield." There was a long silence, during which Samuel imagined security guards verifying his description against witness statements, checking for weapons through their camera feeds, debating whether to call the police or allow him through. Then the gates began to swing open, with a mechanical smoothness that spoke of money and maintenance, and Samuel walked up the long driveway toward the house. his injured shoulder making each step a small negotiation with pain. Richard Whitfield met him at the front door, and the transformation in the man's face was almost shocking in its completeness. Where there had been cold judgment, there was now something that looked almost like reverence, and where there had been dismissal, there was now attention so focused that Samuel felt exposed in a way that was both uncomfortable and strangely validating. Whitfield's handshake was different this time, lasting longer and carrying the weight of genuine emotion rather than obligatory courtesy. And when he invited Samuel inside, the gesture felt less like hospitality and more like welcoming someone who had earned the right to cross this threshold through blood and courage. The interior of the house was as beautiful as Samuel had imagined from his external observations, all polished wood and soft lighting and spaces designed for comfort rather than survival. But what struck him most was the absence of pretension in how Whitfield moved through it, as if the wealth was simply context rather than identity. They sat in a study that smelled of leather and old books, and Whitfield poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter without asking if Samuel drank, assuming shared ritual in a moment that demanded something stronger than words alone could provide. Samuel told his story from the beginning, starting with the job interview and working forward through each decision that had led him to that moment outside the music school, and he watched Whitfield's face cycle through emotions: shame at his own earlier judgment, horror at how close they had come to losing Emma, confusion about why an ex-convict would take such risks for a family that had rejected him. When Samuel finished, describing the fight and his flight from the scene, Whitfield sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his whiskey glass with enough pressure that his knuckles showed white. "I need you to understand something," Whitfield finally said, his voice rough with emotion that had been building throughout Samuel's narrative. "When you came to my office, I saw only your record, only the label that society had attached to you, and I made a decision based on fear and prejudice rather than on who you actually were as a person." He paused, looking down at his drink, as if the amber liquid might contain words he was struggling to find. "My daughter is alive because you refused to let my judgment define your actions, because you saw her humanity even after I had failed to see yours, and I don't know how to begin to express what that means to me and my family." Emma appeared in the doorway of the study before either man could continue, her small form wrapped in a bathrobe that made her look even younger than her 10 years, and her mother stood behind her with a protective hand on the girl's shoulder, both of them watching Samuel with expressions that combined curiosity and gratitude in measures that seemed impossible to separate. Whitfield started to object to Emma's presence, beginning to say something about bedtime and trauma and the need for rest. But Emma shook her head with a determination that suggested she had inherited her father's stubbornness, and she crossed the room to stand directly in front of Samuel's chair. For a long moment she simply studied his face, her eyes moving across the lines that years and hardship had carved there. And Samuel forced himself to remain still under that scrutiny, understanding that whatever she was looking for mattered more than any words he could offer. Then Emma reached out and touched the bandage on his arm, the one that concealed the knife wound he had taken defending her, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tears that had begun to track down her cheeks. "You got hurt because of me," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact that carried the weight of a child, learning that the world contained both danger and sacrifice in equal measure. Samuel shook his head gently, aware that everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see how he would navigate this moment. "I got hurt because bad men tried to do a bad thing," he said, choosing his words with care, "and sometimes stopping bad things means accepting some pain, but that's not your fault, Emma. None of what happened today was your fault." She considered this with the seriousness of someone much older, And then she did something that broke Samuel's heart and repaired it simultaneously. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck in a hug that was fierce and brief and more meaningful than any medal or recognition could ever be. When she pulled back, Emma looked to her father and said simply, "He's a good man, Daddy," and the declaration carried the absolute certainty that children possess before the world teaches them doubt and qualification. Whitfield's expression crumbled then, not into weakness but into something more honest than the composed mask he usually wore, and he nodded slowly while his wife ushered Emma back toward the doorway with whispered promises of hot chocolate and stories before bed. After Emma and her mother left, Whitfield refilled both whiskey glasses and then sat back in his chair with the air of someone preparing to make an offer that had been building since Samuel's arrival. "The job I denied you," Whitfield began, his voice carrying a formality that suggested he was speaking not just as a grateful father, but as a CEO making a business decision, was for a facilities manager position, overseeing maintenance and security for our main office building and 3 satellite locations. It's a position that requires someone who can think strategically, who understands how to read situations and people, who can be trusted with significant responsibility. He paused, taking a sip of his whiskey before continuing. "Based on everything you've told me tonight, and especially based on what you did this afternoon, I believe you're not just qualified for that position, but possibly the most qualified candidate I could find, regardless of what any background check might say." Samuel felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest, a sensation he eventually recognized as hope mixed with disbelief, and he forced himself to breathe slowly while Whitfield continued outlining salary, benefits, and a start date that was shockingly immediate, as if the CEO was afraid Samuel might disappear if given too much time to consider. But even as gratitude washed through him, Samuel felt compelled to resist the easy acceptance that Whitfield's offer represented, to make sure that this opportunity was being given for the right reasons, rather than out of emotional debt that would eventually sour into resentment. "Mr. Whitfield," Samuel said carefully, setting down his whiskey glass untouched, "I appreciate what you're offering more than I can express, but I need you to think carefully about what hiring me would mean for your company. When word gets out about my record, and it will get out, there will be questions from your board, from your employees, from clients who might wonder if they can trust an organization that employs convicted criminals." He watched Whitfield's face for signs of wavering, for the moment when practicality would override gratitude, but the CEO's expression remained steady, almost stubborn in its resolve. Whitfield leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been doing his own thinking during the hours since the kidnapping attempt. "Samuel, I've spent my entire career making decisions based on risk assessment and public perception, building a company by being careful and conventional and never stepping outside the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Today, my daughter was nearly taken from me by men who understood exactly how to exploit the gaps in security that I had believed were sufficient." Whitfield continued, his hands clasped together so tightly that his wedding ring pressed into his flesh. "You saw those gaps too, but instead of exploiting them, you put yourself at risk to close them, and you did it not because you expected reward, but because you understood that a child's life mattered more than your own safety or freedom." He stood and walked to the window that looked out over his manicured lawn, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. "If hiring you costs me clients or board members who can't see past your record, then those are relationships that were never based on values I actually want my company to represent. I'm not offering you this job out of guilt or debt, Samuel. I'm offering it because you've demonstrated a kind of integrity that I've been claiming to value while simultaneously excluding from consideration anyone who didn't arrive at my door with a pristine resume." The words hung in the air between them, and Samuel felt the truth of them settling into his bones like warmth after years of cold. And for the first time since his release from prison, he allowed himself to believe that redemption might be something more than a story people told themselves to feel better about a broken system. Samuel accepted the position that night, shaking Whitfield's hand for the third time in less than a week. But this handshake felt like a beginning rather than an ending. And when Samuel finally left the house and walked back through the gates that had once seemed designed to keep men like him outside, he carried with him a folder containing employment paperwork, a company phone, and a future that felt both terrifying and miraculous in its possibilities. The streets of Atlanta looked different as Samuel made his way back toward his apartment. Or perhaps he was looking at them differently, no longer moving through the city as an invisible ghost, but as someone who had been seen and valued despite every reason society had given him to believe that such recognition was impossible. His shoulder still ached, his arm throbbed beneath its bandage, and his body carried the accumulated exhaustion of days without proper sleep. But beneath all of that was something lighter and stronger than pain. The knowledge that he had made choices that mattered, that his past had not destroyed his capacity to protect and serve, that the man he was becoming was not erased by the man he had been. He stopped at an all-night diner and ordered breakfast, even though it was nearly midnight. Sitting in a booth by the window and watching the city move through its nighttime rhythms while eating eggs and toast that tasted better than any meal he could remember. The waitress refilled his coffee without being asked, offering a tired smile that suggested she understood exhaustion and the need for spaces where people could rest without judgment. Samuel thought about Emma's hug, about Whitfield's transformation from judge to ally, about the job that would start in less than a week and all the ways it could go wrong or miraculously right. He thought about Wade and Marcus, still out there somewhere, probably planning their next operation or fleeing to another city where victims waited unaware. Samuel had given descriptions to Whitfield, who promised to pass them to the police through channels that would not expose Samuel's involvement. But he knew that men like Wade were survivors, adapting to setbacks the way cockroaches adapted to poison, and the thought carried a weight of unfinished business that he tried and failed to ignore completely. The story broke nationally 3 days later when a local reporter connected the dots between the attempted kidnapping, Samuel's intervention, and his criminal record. And what had been a simple tale of heroism became a complicated narrative about second chances, employment discrimination, and the failures of a justice system that punished people long after they had served their sentences. Samuel watched himself become a symbol overnight, his face appearing on news programs and social media feeds, accompanied by commentary from people who had never met him, but who felt qualified to judge whether his redemption was authentic or merely convenient. Some called him a hero deserving of every opportunity, while others questioned why an ex-convict had been surveilling a wealthy family in the first place, suggesting that Samuel's intervention might have been staged or that his presence near the scene was itself suspicious. The scrutiny was overwhelming in its intensity and its invasiveness, digging into every detail of his criminal history, interviewing people from his past who had their own agendas and interpretations, creating a portrait of Samuel that felt both too large and too small to contain the truth of who he actually was. Whitfield held a press conference at his company headquarters, with Emma standing beside him and Samuel positioned slightly behind them. Uncomfortable in the new suit that Whitfield had insisted on buying for the occasion, and the CEO used his platform to speak not just about gratitude, but about the systematic barriers that prevented formerly incarcerated people from rebuilding their lives. "Samuel Carter came to my office seeking employment," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to commanding rooms, "and I denied him that opportunity based solely on his record, without considering his qualifications, his character, or his evident desire to contribute positively to society. Days later, that same man risked his freedom and his life to save my daughter from kidnappers, and in doing so, he showed me everything I needed to know about his character that I had been too prejudiced to see during our interview. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Samuel felt exposed in a way that was different from prison, but no less uncomfortable, as if his entire life was being examined under lights too bright to allow any shadows or privacy. The questions came rapid fire, some directed at Whitfield but many aimed at Samuel himself, asking him to explain his motivations, to defend his past, to perform gratitude and humility for an audience that would judge whether his redemption met their standards. Samuel answered as honestly as he could, describing his surveillance not as stalking, but as the instinctive response of someone who recognized danger and could not walk away, explaining his criminal history without making excuses, but also without providing the kind of detailed confession that would satisfy those who wanted to see him grovel. One reporter asked whether he thought other businesses should follow Whitfield's example in hiring formerly incarcerated people, and Samuel felt the weight of speaking for millions of people whose lives had been derailed by mistakes and by a system designed more for punishment than rehabilitation. "I think," Samuel said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that every person should be judged on who they are now and what they're trying to become, not exclusively on the worst thing they ever did. That doesn't mean ignoring the past or pretending consequences don't matter, but it means allowing people the space to prove that change is possible, that growth is real, that redemption isn't just a word we use to feel good about ourselves while continuing to exclude those who need opportunities most." The press conference became a turning point, not just for Samuel, but for a broader conversation that had been simmering in American culture about criminal justice reform and the collateral consequences of incarceration that extended far beyond prison walls. Advocacy groups reached out to Samuel, asking him to speak at events and lend his story to campaigns for fair chance hiring legislation. And while part of him wanted to retreat from the attention and simply live his life quietly, Samuel recognized that his visibility carried a responsibility to those who remained invisible, whose stories of denied opportunities and closed doors would never make headlines. He began accepting some invitations, speaking at community centers and churches, and even at a congressional hearing about employment discrimination. And in the process, he discovered a voice that could articulate the intersection of justice, mercy, and practical policy in ways that resonated with people across political divides. The work was exhausting, piled on top of his new position at Whitfield Enterprises, but Samuel found meaning in the dual roles of building his own stability while advocating for systemic changes that might make the path easier for those who came after him. At Whitfield Enterprises, Samuel threw himself into the facilities management role with the intensity of someone who understood that every day was an audition, a chance to prove that the faith placed in him was justified. He overhauled security protocols based on the vulnerabilities he had identified during his surveillance of Emma's kidnapping, implementing changes that were both practical and informed by his understanding of how criminals thought and operated. His team, initially skeptical about working under an ex-convict, gradually came to respect his competence and his willingness to listen to their expertise while bringing his own unique perspective to problems they had been solving the same way for years. Samuel was careful never to overstep or claim authority beyond his role, but he also refused to make himself smaller than necessary, understanding that part of his responsibility was to model the dignity that came from doing good work, regardless of one's past. Whitfield checked in regularly, their relationship evolving from employer-employee into something that resembled friendship, though Samuel remained aware of the power differential that could never be entirely erased by gratitude or goodwill. Emma recovered from the trauma of the kidnapping attempt with the resilience of children who are given proper support and safe spaces to process their fear, though she sometimes had nightmares that sent her to her parents' bed, seeking comfort against memories of men with hard faces reaching for her on a sunny afternoon. Samuel saw her occasionally when business required him to visit the Whitfield home, and she always greeted him with a brightness that suggested his presence represented safety rather than a reminder of danger. And these encounters filled Samuel with a protective tenderness that he had not felt since before his incarceration, when he had still believed he might one day have a family of his own. He began volunteering as a mentor for at-risk youth through a program connected to his parole officer, meeting weekly with teenagers whose paths were teetering between the choices that had destroyed Samuel's young adulthood and the alternatives he wished someone had helped him see before it was too late. The work was difficult, often heartbreaking, but it provided Samuel with a sense of purpose that transcended his own redemption and connected him to something larger and more enduring than any single life could contain. 6 months after the kidnapping attempt, the police arrested Wade, Marcus, and 3 other members of their crew in connection with a failed operation in another state, and Samuel was called to testify in proceedings that were closed to the public, but which required him to revisit memories and associations he had hoped to leave buried in his past. Facing Wade across a courtroom, separated by bars and bailiffs, but connected by the strange intimacy of shared history, Samuel felt no satisfaction in the man's downfall, but rather a sad recognition that some people never found the exit from the cycles of crime and consequence that defined their existence. Wade stared at Samuel with hatred so pure it seemed to generate its own heat, and Samuel understood that in Wade's mind the betrayal was not the kidnapping attempt, but Samuel's intervention, the breaking of some code that said former inmates owed loyalty to each other regardless of the harm being done. Samuel testified clearly and without embellishment, describing what he had seen and how he had known to look for it. And when the defense attorney tried to suggest that Samuel's surveillance had been criminally motivated or that his intervention had been violent beyond necessity, Samuel responded with a calmness born from knowing that the truth of his actions spoke louder than any reinterpretation could distort. A year after Emma's rescue, Whitfield Enterprises announced the creation of a second chance hiring initiative, partnering with re-entry organizations to create pathways for formerly incarcerated individuals to find employment, not just in entry-level positions, but across the company's operations. And Samuel was asked to help design the program, bringing his lived experience to bear on policies that too often were created by people who had never experienced the barriers they claimed to be addressing. The initiative became a model that other companies studied and sometimes adopted, though Samuel remained realistic about the limitations of any single program in the face of systemic prejudice that was generations deep and culturally ingrained. He spoke at the initiative's launch event, standing at a podium in the same building where he had once been rejected, and in the audience were dozens of men and women carrying their own histories of mistakes and punishment, looking at Samuel with expressions that mixed hope with the wariness of people who had learned not to trust promises too easily. "I'm not standing here to tell you that one job solves everything," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke from experience rather than theory, or that the path forward will be easy or fair or anything other than the hardest thing you've ever done. "But I am here to tell you that it's possible," he continued, looking out at faces that reminded him of his own reflection in those first months after release. "That change is real, that you are more than the worst chapter of your story, and that there are people and organizations willing to bet on your potential rather than being limited by your past. The applause that followed felt different from the media attention that had initially surrounded his story. This was recognition from people who understood what it meant to be given a chance after the world had decided you didn't deserve one. And their gratitude and their skepticism were both rooted in the same deep need to believe that redemption was more than an abstraction or a feel-good narrative. Samuel met with program participants regularly, serving as both mentor and cautionary tale, honest about his ongoing struggles with the label of ex-convict that never quite disappeared, no matter how many years of good behavior he accumulated or how many lives he touched through his advocacy work. Emma turned 11, then 12, growing from the frightened child who had been targeted for her family's wealth into a thoughtful young person who spoke at school events about the importance of second chances and who volunteered at re-entry programs alongside Samuel. Her presence a powerful reminder of why the work mattered beyond abstract principles of justice. She and Samuel developed an easy rapport built on mutual respect, rather than the patronizing dynamics that sometimes characterized relationships between rescued and rescuer, and Samuel found himself grateful for her friendship in ways that had nothing to do with the job it had led to or the opportunities it had created. Whitfield watched this relationship with something that looked like wonder, as if seeing his daughter interact with someone from such a different world had expanded his own understanding of what family and loyalty could mean beyond the boundaries of class and circumstance. The Whitfields invited Samuel to holiday dinners and Emma's birthday parties, including him in family events with a naturalness that suggested they had forgotten his status as employee or former convict, and simply saw him as someone who belonged in their circle because he had proven himself worthy through action rather than pedigree. But Samuel never forgot the fragility of his position or the speed with which public opinion could turn against him if he made a mistake or if new information about his past emerged that contradicted the redemption narrative that had been constructed around him. He maintained rigid boundaries in his personal life, declining romantic relationships that might complicate his professional standing or provide ammunition to those who remained skeptical about whether ex-convicts deserved the opportunities he had received. His apartment remained sparse and temporary feeling, as if he could not quite allow himself to believe that this new life would last, or that he had truly earned the right to settle into comfort and permanence. The nightmares that had plagued his first years after release diminished, but never entirely disappeared, and sometimes Samuel would wake in darkness with his heart racing, convinced for disoriented moments that he was back in his cell and that everything since the rescue, the job, the advocacy work, Emma's friendship, had been nothing but an elaborate dream his mind had constructed to make incarceration bearable. Samuel's parole ended on a Tuesday morning in early spring, the official termination of state supervision, marked by a final meeting with his parole officer in an office that smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic resignation. The officer, a tired woman named Martinez, who had seen hundreds of men cycle through her caseload with varying degrees of success and failure, shook Samuel's hand and told him with genuine warmth that he was one of the few who had made her believe the system could actually work if given proper support and genuine opportunities. Samuel left that office feeling lighter than he had in years. The invisible tether that had connected him to the criminal justice system finally severed, though he knew that the record would remain, accessible to anyone who wanted to look. A permanent mark that no amount of good work could fully erase. He walked through Atlanta's streets with a freedom that was both legal and psychological, no longer required to report his movements or account for his associations, and he allowed himself a moment of pure celebration, stopping at a park bench to simply sit and feel the sun on his face without the weight of supervision pressing down on his shoulders. That evening, Whitfield threw a small gathering at his home to mark Samuel's completion of parole, inviting the core team from the Second Chance Hiring Initiative and several of Samuel's mentees who had successfully maintained employment and avoided reincarceration during the program's first year. Emma made a cake that was lopsided and overly sweet, but which Samuel ate with genuine appreciation, touched by the gesture and by the card she had made that featured a drawing of him standing between her and shadowy figures, with the caption, "My Hero," written in her careful handwriting. Speeches were made, toasts were offered, and Samuel found himself surrounded by people whose lives had intersected with his in ways that felt purposeful rather than accidental, as if the random chaos of existence had briefly aligned to create something meaningful and lasting. He thought about the men who had tried to kidnap Emma, now serving long sentences in facilities similar to where Samuel had spent those years of his life, and he wondered if any of them would find their own paths to redemption, or if they would remain locked in cycles of crime and punishment until age or violence ended their stories. The thought carried no judgment, only a deep sadness for lives that might have gone differently if circumstances had been kinder, or choices had been wiser, or second chances had come before it was too late. Late that night, after the guests had left and the Whitfields had retired upstairs, Samuel stood alone in the backyard of the house where he had once conducted surveillance with criminal intent to prevent, looking up at stars that seemed clearer than they ever had in the city, as if completing parole had somehow sharpened his vision or allowed him to see beauty he had been too burdened to notice before. He thought about the question that had haunted him throughout his incarceration and his re-entry. Whether a person could truly change, or whether the past defined us so completely that transformation was only an illusion we told ourselves to make endurance possible. Standing there in the darkness with grass beneath his feet and the distant sound of traffic providing urban soundtrack to his reflection, Samuel decided that the answer was both and neither. That change was real, but never complete. That the past shaped us without necessarily determining our futures, that redemption was a process rather than a destination, and that the work of becoming someone better than who we had been was work that never truly ended but continued with each choice, and each day we were granted. He had been denied a job by a man who could not see past his record, had saved that man's daughter using knowledge gained from the worst chapter of his life, and had built from those contradictory elements a future that honored both the pain of his mistakes and the possibility of grace. It was not a perfect resolution, not the clean ending that stories sometimes promised, but it was true, and it was his, and for Samuel Carter, that was enough.